what the greatest betrayal of the Australian people in our nation's history has ever been? It is the introduction of the policy of multiculturalism in the 70s, under Gough Whitlam and finally under Malcolm Fraser. Now, why do I call the introduction of multiculturalism the biggest betrayal of Australians? Well, Australians did not ask for it. There was no referendum held asking Australians whether they wanted to go from a country where people assimilate to a prevailing Anglo-Celtic culture to a policy where all cultures are allowed in and encouraged to be themselves. Australians were never asked. And when you think about it, can you think of a more important thing that Australians should be asked about than the identity of this country? This country was settled and built by people mainly, almost 100%, of an Anglo-Celtic background. Now, it is absolutely true that in the 19th century, you had people from China, you had people from other countries coming in and making their contributions. But the great project that is Australia, in its political institutions, its economic institutions, its educational institutions, its instincts, its temperament, its entertainment, is Anglo-British, is Anglo-Celtic. That was and is, to a large extent, I still think today, our identity. But in the mid-70s, under Fraser and Gough Whitlam, they just completely changed the policy from assimilation to multiculturalism and said anyone from any culture can come in. Our culture is no longer Anglo-Celtic, our culture is multiculturalism. We need to abolish multiculturalism, bring back assimilation, and re-emphasize the Anglo-Celtic heritage of our country. Because if we do not do this, our country will continue to fracture and pull apart as different people turn within their own cultures to define who they are, and Australia will barely have an identity left.
So this is one of the biggest confusions in the multicultural debate in Australia, confusing multiculturalism with multiracialism. And one of the biggest tricks of advocates of multiculturalism is to convince people that opposing multiculturalism is racist. And as you can see, it's worked. In fact, a lot of the comments I get when I say we need to abolish multiculturalism basically say, well, this is racist. But again, multiculturalism and multiracialism are two different things. I actually have no problem with a multiracial Australia as long as we recognise that the Anglo-Celtic heritage in Australia is what created this country and built this country for the most part right up to the 1990s. And even it's still very powerful to this day. My problem with multiculturalism is that it demotes the Anglo-Celtic heritage to just one culture among many, when in actual fact it should be considered the core culture that everyone honours because it's the heritage of this country. And again, it's the culture that created the country that everyone wants to come to. So my problem with multiculturalism is that it basically says all cultures are fine, they can all come over here, they can all basically not have to worry about integrating into a prevailing Anglo-Celtic culture. The problem with that is it breeds a lot of social division, and it also misleads immigrants into thinking that there isn't a strong prevailing culture here when there actually is. And that, I think, would be very confusing to a lot of people. There is a strong culture in Australia here, and it is still an Anglo-Celtic culture, but obviously other cultures have made their contributions. But the emphasis should be on integration into a prevailing culture, not just sort of diversity for the sake of diversity, which leads to social division. And it also stops us from being able to say, hey, this is who we are, and there are certain cultural groups that we want to be very careful about creating huge communities of them in Australia because they're not going to fit in very well with the prevailing culture. An obvious example of that would be large Islamic communities in Australia. So again, being anti-multicultural is not being racist. Multiculturalism and multiracialism are two different things.
Between 1788 and 1868, there were about 162,000 convicts that were transported from the UK into the colonies in Australia. These convicts were transported for minor offences like theft, fraud, and violence, and today about 20% of Australians can trace their ancestry back to these folks. During the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, transportation was a popular punishment for crimes that weren't serious enough for the death penalty. All these crimes were considered misdemeanors, and they carry a sentencing between 7 to 14 years. Most convicts transported into Australia would work unpaid trade positions until their sentencing was up. Once their sentencing was up, they would receive a certificate of freedom, which meant that they can either remain in Australia or pay their own way back home. What's really interesting is that 1 out of 7 convicts were women, and they would quickly attach themselves to an officer or convict for their own protection. And most of the women convicted were convicted of theft, especially when starvation was rampant in the UK. Australia became the prime place for transportation, especially after the Revolutionary War broke out in North America. Prisons in the UK became overcrowded, and there were no other place to send convicts of less severe crimes. And many of these convicts were later able to rise into prominent positions in the Australian society.
What's a historical fact that you had to learn on your own and not in?
Colonization in Australia was 100 times worse than what the books in our schools depicts it to be. Whilst I learn about the Australian history, they never once mention about the genocide, the assimilation, the enslavement, or the inhumane living condition they subjected the indigenous people of these countries that they colonized to be subjected to. If anything, they glamorize the concept of colonization and empower it that it was needed because the British Empire needed to thrive. But if anything, the Australian history is exactly the same. The first fleet indeed arrived on the coastal region of the Australian island, where Cook and his counterpart assessed and concluded that indigenous people only resided on the coastal areas of the Australian island. So the history of Australia stated that the first fleet arrived in Sydney, where they were met with some resistance, and then after that it was just so hard for indigenous people to integrate with white Europeans, hence why there was a lot of wars and unnecessary deaths that took place, which again they played off like they were not responsible for it. If anything, they leave out the part that how they arrived on the coastal region of Sydney when the first fleet landed. They specifically came down with weapons to kill, because obviously they assumed that indigenous people would only be able to reside on the coastal areas of the Australian island, where they soon to find out that that was not the case. If anything, indigenous people actually resided more inland, which was something that they were not ready for. And hence why it took them almost 100 years to try and fully remove indigenous people from Australia, which again, they've never been able to succeed. And what led through those years was inhumane treatment of indigenous people, which resulted in programs to try and assimilate them, destroy their language, destroy their lineage, and destroy their culture, and destroy their presence on the Australian soil. And let's not forget, when the massacre and the genocide stopped, they put structures that systemically would depopulate indigenous people of Australia, which again, a lot of schools don't teach it because apparently it's very morbid, but again, that's the real history of this country. These parts and version of history, you're not going to find it in your school because again, it's considered not educationally appropriate, when again, that's the real history of this country.
That I will be faithful and I bear true allegiance to the colonising Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Senator Thorpe. I'm going to wait for quiet. Senator Thorpe, you are required to recite the oath as printed on the card, so please recite the oath.
None of us like it.
There's a reason Australia loves Israel, as a state, not the people. I feel like, we've got a lot in common. Both countries are very young. Australia's only a couple hundred years old. Israel, 76 years old. Very young, 76. There are people that have lived in Israel longer than Israel has lived in Palestine. Well, that is very young. Both countries, Australia and Israel, both have a lot of white people in very hot places. So they're obviously indigenous to the land. And both countries, Australia and Israel, were formed off the back of some pretty genocidal mantras. Australia started off the back of terra nullius, which means nobody's land. Israel, a land without a people, for a people without a land. So both countries, colonisers just rocked up, all like, oh, well, there's nobody here. There's absolutely nobody here. And then they proceeded to kill absolutely nobody and steal their land and start their countries. That's another similarity. And also, both countries, Australia, Israel, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the British. I mean, I don't know where we'd be, but that's a separate show,
You're learning so many important things, and I'm so proud of you.
Most white people in America and Europe believe about their history is not history at all. It's mythology, designed to produce a specific kind of person. A person who does not feel guilty, a person who does not feel accountable, a person who does not feel responsible for ever changing anything because they don't think they're doing anything wrong. They're taught that their ancestors were pioneers, their ancestors were explorers and builders of civilization, that they've brought progress and democracy and enlightenment to the world. They hear about the Renaissance, they hear about the Industrial Revolution, they hear about the Age of Discovery, and so forth and so on. And not about enslavement, not about genocide, not about the theft, not about the destruction that their people are responsible for. They're not taught that their prosperity was built on unimaginable suffering. They're not taught that their systems of government, their financial empires, their very sense of national identity are all rooted in exploitation. They don't know about the crimes. They don't know the real legacy of their people. And so they don't change. They don't have to change because they don't even realize what they need to correct. When we look at colonialism, for example, the history that's taught in Western schools is usually an abstraction. Colonization is framed as something that it just sort of happened a long time ago, something that was maybe unfortunate, but it was inevitable, and ultimately it represented progress, and there were many beneficial things to come from it. Never mind the millions of Africans who died in the Congo Free State under King Leopold. Most white Americans have never heard of them. Never mind the Bengal famine of 1943 when millions of Indians starved to death due to British policies. They don't even know about it. The fact that the American police forces evolved from slave patrols, they don't know about that either. And they're not any more informed about the ongoing crimes, like the pillage of African resources today, the economic neocolonialism that keeps entire regions of the world impoverished, the exploitation of labor in the global south. These aren't relics of history. That's the present day reality of what your people are doing. But the story that that white people are told does not include those realities, or else it packages those realities deceitfully and dishonestly. They packaged them dishonestly and deceitfully in the past just like they do now. The irony is that when they're confronted with the truth, many of these people will react defensively. I didn't do that. That was in the past. Why should I feel guilty? But this reaction in and of itself reveals how little they're really understanding. It's not about guilt. It's about responsibility. If a person inherits a stolen house, they may not have stolen it themselves, but they still live in it. And if they refuse to acknowledge where that house came from or how it came into their possession, if they insist that that house is rightfully theirs because the crime happened a long time ago, well, then they're complicit because the theft is ongoing. The crime never really stopped. So when people don't know their history, they cannot recognize when history is repeating itself and when history is actually just a continuum into the present.